this week, not really taking much of a break from talking about miracles per se, because this remarkable woman's life is full of plenty of really supernatural, miraculous events. Certainly she was a great mystic of the Middle Ages. She lived in a very challenging time. Would have been a challenging time for anyone to have lived in the 14th century, but particularly a woman. And one of the things that I really feel very drawn to her about and want to share with other people is the strength of her character, even though she only lived 33 years. The strength of her character, her contribution to the church, to the faith, which we'll talk about in the form of many of her writings and many of her letters, but also the fact, and again, to go back and underscore this, that she was a woman living in the 14th century who not only sort of challenged what her parents wanted for her, which was, of course, to marry, as young women did, but she also challenged, she was willing to take on everyone from bishops to cardinals to the Pope. And some of her letters that you can read even today in the 21st century, reading her letters that she wrote to cardinals and popes, where she calls them out. To be a woman in any age is remarkable to do that. A woman in her age is quite unusual indeed. So really what I wanted to do was to look at her life through those primary source documents, as I say, in her own words, to look at what she had to say, not only to others in the age that she lived in, but maybe more importantly, what she still says to us today. Because remember, as I said, she lived in a very chaotic age, but don't we all? Do you ever feel like you live in a chaotic time? Very tumultuous time? She certainly did. So, not really departing from our theme of miracles at all, because I will be talking a little bit about some of the supernatural events sort of surrounding her very brief life on earth. So just after his election as Pope in 1978, Pope St. John Paul II stood before her tomb, which is there. Many of you probably have been there at Santa Maria de Minerva in Rome. She's right there under the altar. He stood before the tomb of St. Catherine of Siena, and this is what he said. I must thank divine wisdom for having willed to make use of this simple but profound heart of a woman to point out the way in a period of great uncertainty in the church, but especially what she said to the successors of St. Peter. Such great love and great courage, and I would underscore courage, such wonderful simplicity, but also such wonderful depth of soul. A person who was open to all of the inspirations of the Holy Spirit, but also conscious of her mission. That was 1978. So let's go back a little bit in time to 1461, on the date of her canonization. 1461, Pope Pius II said these words of her, quote, "She was a woman of profound wisdom, but not a wisdom acquired over time and with great effort, such as through learning, but a wisdom infused by the Holy Spirit, so that in this way, her wisdom extends beyond herself, beyond those who knew her, beyond her own lifetime." Okay, so we have two popes, 500 years apart, right, who are saying these things. But in between these two successors of St. Peter, who, as I said, lived 500 years apart, there was another, Blessed Pope Paul VI, who declared her, this simple yet profound, wise woman, declared her to be a doctor of the church. A doctor of the church. And we'll talk more about what that means. Some of you might remember we've explored that in here a little bit before. It's not something that is afforded to many people in history to have the title of doctor of the church. And she is one of only 4 women who are. So, in the year of her birth, 1347, you have to understand the context, the age that she is born into, 1347, Siena, northern Italy. Italy is in the throes of bubonic plague. The plague broke out the year before, 1346. The first case was in Sicily, swept very rapidly northward, So that by 1347, when she was born, the plague had reached northern Italy, and the area that she lived in was really in the grips of an epidemic, a horrific epidemic. Imagine being born into such a world, being born into that. This devastating illness that claimed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population in less than a decade. In less than a decade. There has been no more destabilizing event in all of history than that 14th century, well, in general, the 14th century, specifically the bubonic plague. And actually, I think I've talked about this in here before, maybe when we looked at the first 1,500 years of Christianity, if you were here for that. I know I explored this sort of social theme that the 14th century in general is referred to by medieval historians as being not only the most chaotic in all of history, but we describe it as a major turn. And using that expression, major turn, means that we realize that the world would not be the same after the 14th century. That the events of that century, which included bubonic plague, 100 Years' War, famine on an unprecedented scale that had never been seen in Europe before or since, and the crisis in the church, which is, of course, what she directly addresses with a couple of prelates of the church. All of those events create a scenario where anything after the 14th century is going to be forever altered by that. Population loss of an incredible, very rapid effect, to say nothing of the loss of nobility, the entire loss of nobility in both, primarily on the French side, but also on the English side during the 100 Years' War, causes some social issues. And while all of that is going on, the church is in a major crisis, a period we call the Babylonian captivity of the church. This is the age that St. Catherine of Siena is born into. This is the Europe she sort of entered as an infant, and as I said, lived only 33 years. It's a really fascinating woman, though. I mean, she truly is. A young woman who defied her parents' initial wishes, at least, that she marry. She chose it, of course, to dedicate her life to the church. She was a mystic who was gifted with the stigmata. She had another very profound mystical experience I'm going to talk a little bit about today. She was a woman in a completely male-dominated society who boldly took on a pope and challenged him to reform the church. And as I said, today she is one of the 4 female doctors of the church. That title, let's go back and highlight that again. That title is reserved for people who have made significant intellectual contributions, lasting intellectual contributions to the faith. And there are 3 conditions really that have to be met in order to be a doctor of the church. There are 36 of them, by the way. Only 36 of them in 2,000 years of church history. That first of all, they must have a holiness, and this is directly out of the church doctrine. They must have a holiness that is outstanding even among saints. So it's not enough to be a saint. You've got to be, a saint times 2, whatever. A holiness outstanding even among saints. The depth of their doctrinal insights and contributions to current and future understandings of the faith, that has to be significantly above the average, something that is uncommon. And finally, they must leave behind, and in the case of St. Catherine of Siena, this is really important because they must leave behind a legacy of writings, a corpus of writings that future generations can read with the same clarity and the same understanding as their contemporaries could. In other words, she's not writing new doctrine, she's not creating new doctrine, but illuminating existing doctrine, the truth, for those of her own age. Well, if the truth is the truth, then obviously what the church recognizes is that what she had to say in 1366 or 1367 is just as relevant today because it speaks to the same truth. And this is important for her because, again, how many women of the Middle Ages could leave behind a legacy of writings? How many women had that level of education? So we're going to talk a little bit about how she acquires that. Now, her feast day approaches next Sunday. It actually falls on Sunday this year. It's April 29th. And so in case you're wondering why we didn't do Catherine of Siena on her feast day like we've addressed some of the others, it really was an issue of scheduling because of First Communion's happening today, I believe. Is that right? And Father Peter wanted to conclude the year on the 29th by looking at the miracle at Grand Coteau and obviously talking about his recent pilgrimage to the Holy Land and visit to Rome. So we sort of switched the schedule, and that's why. So just know that when her feast day falls next Sunday, just remember some of these remarkable things about her, if you will. So, as I mentioned, today what I'd like to do is examine her life in her own words. And that means looking at some of these wonderful writings that she left behind, what she contributed to us, and also look at some of the miracles that are associated in her own life. But before we do that, I really want to go back and make sure that you understand not just the 14th century as being chaotic from the perspective of war, plague, famine, and crisis in the church, because that's not enough, right? It's not enough. Medieval society itself is something that would seem very difficult, very foreign to us. And this will give you maybe perhaps all the perspective you need to know. Her mother was 40 years old when she was born, and she was the 25th child. The women's eyes got big, for sure. She was the 25th child born to her mother, who was 40 when she was born. Okay, now, I'll go ahead and tell you there were a few sets of twins in there. Okay, that make you feel better? There's a few sets of twins in there. Of those 25 children, only 13 lived to adulthood, which again is in its own way, a commentary on medieval society, isn't it? This was still an age, the 14th century, still an age when roughly 1 out of 4 childbirths resulted in the death of the child or the mother or both. So the fact that her mother bore 25 children, for the mother, that's pretty incredible for her to have lived through that many childbirths. And I think it's fair to say that her mother was an old woman at 40 when Catherine was born. Now, one of the things that, of course, I wanted to know was, well, okay, most of her hagiography refers to the fact that she was the 25th child. So I was like, well, my gosh, are there more? Was she just were they keeping a record? She just falls in there 25 and there's like 32 or something? But actually, she and her sister who did not live, the twin sister did not live, they were the last children born to her parents. But the crisis in the church that really spans her lifetime is what is known as the Babylonian captivity. And I mentioned that before, the Babylonian captivity. Anybody kind of remember what that was? I got a nod over here. Anybody else kind of remember what that was? It's okay. I'm not getting ready to give you a test. I was just curious if it rang a bell with anyone. So because of the and this could be the subject of a whole other talk, and I don't want to go down a rabbit trail, but because of the very complex European political conditions of the turn of the 14th century, the papacy relocated its headquarters from Rome to Avignon in France in 1308, 1309. Part of the reason for this actually rested in a pope by the name of Boniface VIII, who died in 1307. But Boniface VIII and the King of France, who was King Philip IV, had a true, not even a love-hate relationship. I don't think there was fair to say there's much love involved in it at all, or affection on either end. But a real challenging relationship, because Boniface VIII is the one who wrote a very famous, now famous, bull called Unum Sanctum, One Holy, in which he describes that there are 2 swords at work in the world. There's the spiritual sword of the church, and the secular sword of the state. And what Boniface VIII says in this particular bull, it's really directed, we think, perhaps even directly to the King of France, tells him directly that in all matters, the church is supreme. In all matters. And Philip IV encountered so much resistance with this pope, trying to get his own agenda in his own kingdom underway, that when Boniface VIII died in 1307, we don't know the extent to which this was influenced by Philip IV, but it just so happened that the next pope elected, who was Clement V, was the cousin of the French king. Okay, he's the cousin of the French king. And under pressure from the King of France, he moves the papacy from what was really kind of a neutral, objective place, Rome always having been the home of the successors of St. Peter. He moved the papacy from there to France. And so it remained there until 1377. So almost exactly 70 years, we have this period that's called the Babylonian captivity of the church. And the reference, obviously, the biblical reference is to an exile. Right? That the church, the papacy, was in exile in France. And in case you're wondering why this might be a problem, why is it not okay for the papacy to be in France and not in Rome? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, as I said, Rome being the historic Holy See of the successors of St. Peter, its association with its dual apostolicity of both St. Peter and St. Paul was hugely significant in the identity of the church. The second thing is that Rome, as I said, was mostly neutral and objective. It was known to be the venue, the domain of the church, of the Western Church. So for the papacy to relocate into a territory that is now directly under the authority of the French king, think about what kind of message this sends to the rest of the world. That the Pope is little more than a puppet of the French king, number one. And let's add a whole other layer to this, to her life even. In 1337, actually before she was born, King Edward III of England set out to claim the throne of France in what's called the 100 Years' War. So what English king is going to send money to support a papacy that is headquartered in the land of his enemy? Do you see? All right. The reason this is so important is because as Catherine of Siena grows up, and this is the environment, the world she lives in, and she realizes the significance of the papacy not being in Rome, the historicity of the Holy See of Rome, and she realizes that these Avignon popes are among the most corrupt in history. Among the most corrupt in history. And it's not hard to see why. England withdraws all of its financial support of the papacy. So this papacy, they have to build a palace of the popes. They don't have a place to live, right? So they have to build a palace of the popes, which they have to pay for in Avignon. And without the money to do this, the church gets kind of creative about raising money. Anybody want to guess how they do this? Okay. They do. They seize land from people, families who have no heirs. That's actually going on all over Europe. King of England does that. Selling of indulgences. The selling of church offices, selling of benefices, as we call a simony, the selling of offices, is rampant. And so Catherine grows up in this world, and she's aware of this. Now, I want to add something that that this 100 Years' War that's going on, lest we think that it is a constant thing, that there was 100 years of fighting. Let me just add this footnote to that. They had to take off frequent breaks because of plague. literally. 1346, there's a battle in Crécy in northern France, and the next major battle is not until 1356 at Poitiers. Literally, they take a 10-year break because of the plague. Both kings say to each other, why don't you go home and replenish your army and come back? We'll come back a different day. And so it wasn't a continuous conflict, but certainly it was always sort of churning in the background and always driving everything. You cannot separate what's going on in the church from what's going on in society. You absolutely cannot separate those things. Okay, so when Pope Clement VI, an Avignon Pope, in 1343, sells his first indulgence, this shows up in many of the medieval chronicles. People are increasingly critical of this practice and increasingly critical of the church. This, again, is how this young woman was framed. Because as a teenager, she wanted to join, she wanted to become part of the third order of the Dominicans, a tertiary. Does everybody know what that means? It means that you don't take the full veil, you don't take the full vow. You're able to live basically as a layperson in the world, but you do take some vows to serve the order. So she was heavily influenced by some Dominican sisters that she came to know, and it was her wish to join this particular group of them called the Sisters of Penitence. Well, as I said, it's a third order, and so the Sisters of Penitence were mostly widows. They were a lot of elderly women who had lived lives in the world. They'd raised their children, their husbands were dead, and they did not take the full vows of the Dominican order, but they lived in a little congregation by themselves, but still in the world. And she was initially refused because she was too young. She was 14 when she wanted to do this. And so her parents said, no, we don't want you to do that. We want you to marry. Your sister, your older sister, just died, so that we don't have to do anything about the dowry. We want you to marry her husband. And so Catherine, according to all of the hagiography about her, cut her hair off like a boy's. I mean, like sheared it to the scalp so that she would make herself less attractive. She obviously didn't want to marry the man, but she really wanted to dedicate her life to the church. So she does become part of that, eventually become part of that Sisters of Penitence, but not until she was 18. She began living with them at the age of 16, but not really entering their community until she was 18. And there are so many different aspects, from 18 years to 33. She doesn't have a very long life. But from 18 years to 33, there's so many different aspects of her life that we could talk about, any one of which would have been a class of its own. First of all, the mystic St. Catherine of Siena, the scholar St. Catherine of Siena. The Dominican sisters taught her to read, and boy, did she read everything that she could. And again, remember, it's a male-dominated world. Because of the companionship, the friendship of a man she came to know, Blessed Raymond of Capua, who was her companion for many years, he was able to get access to books for her and help her further her studies. So she left behind in her brief 33-year life over 400 letters that have survived. Those are the ones that have survived. And each one of them is a work of art. Every single one of them. And they're written to various people. They're written to people from all walks of life. She writes to her sisters, her religious sisters. She writes to family. She writes to friends. We have some letters that have survived that she wrote to Francis of Blessed Raymond of Capua. But the most intriguing, the most fascinating letters are the ones that she writes to officials in the church. Very boldly does that. She also left behind a work called the Dialogue. It's a really comprehensive sort of stream of consciousness, really, but it is about her conversations with God and about very, very intimate, very private things that many people probably would never share, but recounting her conversations, her prayer life, her personal prayer life with God, and the ways in which He answered her. and the ways in which she believed the Holy Spirit was speaking to her every single day. It is a very comprehensive work as well. Okay, so one thing I love about her letters is every single one of them opens the exact same way. And it is a way, I think, that emphasizes her humility. Her humility. This is the way. It always helps when I turn this on, I've noticed. I, Catherine, servant and slave of God's servants, am writing to encourage you in the precious blood of God's Son. Every letter opens this way. So she lets you know right up front that whatever she's going to say to you is to do what? To encourage you. Encourage you. Which is going to be a helpful way of addressing some of the prelates of the church. Because some of what she says does not sound like encouragement, but rebuking and scolding. So she has another way of ending those letters, which is, please know that I say this only for your salvation. Please know I say this only for your salvation. It was the Dominican sisters, as I said, who taught her to read and write. And she apparently, by all accounts, was very gifted intellectually. She's very bright. And of course, a great light to so many people. The contemporary accounts we have of her is that she was not just a free-thinking spirit for the age in which she lived, but had that personality that would light up a room when she walked in. People were naturally attracted to her. She was very charismatic, and people listened when she wrote and when she spoke. She, as I said, determined to give what time she had on earth to the building up of God's people, but more specifically, the reform of the church. Saw the church as being, of course, in great, great turmoil. Now, as far as her personal life of piety, which will figure into obviously to her life and her letters, her work as well, she lived a very austere existence. Before she became a Dominican tertiary, her parents agreed to let her live basically in a corner of the basement, in a cell. She limited herself to one small meal a day. When she grew older, and by older I mean into her late 20s, she would go many days subsisting only on the Holy Eucharist. She scourged herself frequently in penance, not only for herself, as she says in her dialogues, but for the sins that she saw in those around her. She also wore a hair shirt for a period of her 20s. Everybody know what a hair shirt is? No? Okay. So a hair shirt, a very typically medieval way to do penance was to take the hide of livestock, usually a horse or a cow, and turn it to where the hair is on the inside. You bind it very tightly around your body so that over a period of days, it breaks down the skin. It's actually very dangerous and should not be done. I don't suggest anybody do this today, but should you decide to do so, it shouldn't be done without spiritual direction, that's for sure. It breaks down the skin, and it's a way of doing penance. It's very uncomfortable, very painful, and it appears in many of the medieval chronicles of even people up to kings and cardinals, princes, for instance, who do this as a way of penance. But she did that, but she traded her hair shirt in for chains that she wore very tightly wrapped to her body so that they cut into the skin. And this is a practice that her spiritual director finally made her stop because she was doing serious injury to herself. She also, this is the part that I struggle with. I'm like, you read her hagiography and you go, okay, well, I might could get by on one meal a day. Would depend on what it was, right? What time of the day it was. I might could do that. I don't know about the hair shirt. The chains, I guess it would depend on what they look like. But then you get to the part that really sort of made my eyeballs fly open, is that she believed that she could sleep, or would sleep, only 30 minutes a day. And she trained herself to do this. She got no more than 30 minutes of sleep in any 24-hour period from the time she was about 25 until her death at 33. So, do all of these severe physical penances that she took on, did they contribute to her early demise? I mean, I think that's a fair question. She also, remember, had other physical sufferings as well, besides these penances that she did. She took the white habit for purity. She wore, many times in art you see her depicted this way. She's wearing a white habit for purity with a black cape. The black represents humility and, of course, death. So she always wanted to be a reminder to herself of her own death. And at 19, the year after she entered the Dominican Tertiary, she had what's called a mystical marriage. She had an experience that she describes in the dialogues of a mystical marriage to Christ. She experienced a vision of both Mary and Jesus, and that he placed a ring on her finger, and that it was a ring that no one else could see, but she swore to the end of her life that it was there, that she could see it. And this is what she says in the dialogues that he said to her. You are not to love me for your own sake, or your neighbor for your own sake, but to love me for myself. Yourself for myself, your neighbor for myself. And then she goes on to write about how everything that we do and every encounter we have with every other human being in this journey of life is about him. It's never about you, and it's never about that person. It's about encountering him. Now, as you might imagine, in the post-Enlightenment world, St. Catherine of Siena has been heavily criticized by those great thinkers because she describes a mystical experience, a mystical marriage, that Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers would tell you that this was simply a young woman's desire to avoid marriage and to transfer those feelings of affection, the natural attraction a woman would have for a man, onto Jesus, and that there's something sick about this. And I don't want to get into any of that, but I will tell you, you will encounter that about her as you read, particularly 20th century literature about her. Many of her biographers of the 20th and 21st century have not been as kind to her because of this. The following year, she received the stigmata. And as a matter of fact, remember we talked about that. How many of you were here for that talk on the stigmata? If you weren't here, it's going to be posted this week on the website, okay? If you weren't here to hear that. I went back up and show you. This is actually, if you got my email, this is the same painting that I sent in the email of her receiving the stigmata. Now, to bear the wounds of Christ. But when she received the stigmata, a year after her mystical marriage to Christ, she prayed that her stigmata would be invisible. And the reason she wanted it to be invisible, she says, is that she did not want others to be alarmed by her suffering. So, for the rest of her life, she had the physical pain of the wounds of Christ daily, but did not exhibit the physical outward signs. So, remember again the age in which she lives. There would have quite naturally been a desire for anyone to spend a great deal of time in reflection, contemplation, and prayer. And she is someone who took this, obviously, quite seriously. Yet, she traveled extensively. Again, really, really unusual for a woman of the 14th century. Again, as I said, often in the company of many others. She did not travel alone, usually in the company of Blessed Raymond of Capua, who left behind a great, not only physical description of her, but much we know about her personality is what he tells her. He became a spiritual director to her as well. And she traveled all over, not only all over Italy, but also spent a great deal of time in France and on the Iberian Peninsula, what would become Spain. And we know that she traveled to Avignon. We don't know how many times she went. We don't know how many times she met with one particular pope, but we know she met with him, Gregory the 11th. So, again, unusual for a woman of her age, the period in which she lives. So in these 400 letters, and I just pulled out a few little jewels for you. I didn't want to go into any tremendous detail about who these letters were written to or why. Some of them sound rather soundbite-ish, but do you know that really sort of underscores when something is significant and timeless? If you can quote a woman in a sentence from the 14th century and it makes sense to you today, there's some universal negative truth in there, isn't there? So much rich advice, not only to the world that she lived in its turmoil, but the turmoil of the world we live in today. So the wisdom that you find here is really undeniable. She says this, do not fear or question. You must believe that in this life, whatever God gives or permits is for your salvation. So whatever happens, and again, taking this in context, what she's saying is, whatever happens in your life, it is for you. It is a gift. It is for your salvation. If God has given it to you, or if He has permitted it, it serves one purpose, and that is for your salvation. She says, our souls are never at peace with worldly things because they are all less than we are. I love this, and I need to be reminded of this. They have been made for us, not we for them. The things of the world. Right? They have been made for us, not we for them. And we think that materialism is just something of the 21st century. She's writing to an age, remember the 14th century is where we begin, especially in Italy. Italy's already commercial and capitalistic. And so she sees the beginnings of what's going to become a true consumer culture. And that's what she's writing about. Remember, those things were made for us, not us for them. There is only one thing to do then. Okay, let me set the stage for this, because this is important. This is in a letter that she's writing explaining why she has given her entire love, her entire affection to Jesus. And she's rejected worldly relationships. She says this, there's only one thing to do, and that is to invest our affection, our desire, our love into something stronger than ourselves. I mean in God, the source of all of our strength and the author of all love. And again, the context is why she's made this decision. And she doesn't really diss the people in her lives. She's not dismissive of them. But it's written in such a way that you understand that she felt the real pain of being disappointed in people. You know? That we let each other down. That humankind is broken. And this is why she's made this decision. This is the ultimate. This is the best she could ever do. And the best, in fact, I think she says we all could do. So, do you remember how I told you that she wrote letters to all kinds of different people? There are records about young priests who were studying, or seminarians who were studying to become priests, who would seek out her advice. Can you imagine this in the 14th century? And so there's this beautiful letter that she wrote to a young man who had just been ordained a priest, and whom she developed a correspondence with. And she had one piece of advice to give him, and I love this. She said, preach the truth as if you had a million voices. It is silence that kills the world. And again, the context is, if I only could tell you one thing to do in your entire priesthood, a woman telling a man how to be a priest, right? If there's one thing that I could tell you, this is it. Preach the truth as if you had a million voices. Isn't that beautiful? It truly is. And of course, she took on a pope. And this is where it gets interesting. Pope Gregory the 11th, to be exact, who's Pope, he is not Pope from 1370 to 1378. Technically, his Avignon papacy ended in 1377 when he moved it back to Rome. But again, these popes of this particular period, 1307 to 1377, while we have this Babylonian captivity of the church, they were corrupt. Many of them lived very worldly lives. They were openly selling offices, or at least, wink, wink, they knew it was going on. As I mentioned, the first indulgence had been sold by Pope Clement VI in 1343, so that was a practice that was continuing. And so he just happened to be Pope when she sort of came into her full awareness of what she believed God wanted her to do. So she believed with all of her heart that the papacy had to return to Rome. She became convinced, as I mentioned, not just because of its historicity, that the Holy See has always been in Rome, but because she believed it was good for the church and it was good for the people that the papacy be in its historic place, that it be in the place of the apostles, Peter and Paul, where it was understood to belong. So she wrote letters, and as I said, we believe she met with Pope Gregory XI, although we do not know how many times she may have met with him. But I want to share some of these with you, and these are just worth sort of letting sink in a little bit. Reminder, this is a young woman in the 14th century writing a private letter to the man who is the vicar of Christ. Okay? Have I given you enough preparation for this? And this is again addressed to Gregory XI. Since Christ has given you authority and you have accepted it, you ought to be using the power and strength that is yours. If you don't intend to use it, it would be better and more to God's honor and the good of your soul to resign. If I were in your place, I would be afraid of incurring divine judgment. Anybody here imagine doing this to sweet Pope Francis today? So she's very direct. And of course she ends the letter, by saying, of course I'm concerned about your salvation. I only write these words because I'm concerned about your salvation. Okay. More directly to the point, though, later in the letter, there is this. Cursed be you, for time and power were entrusted to you, and you did not use them. In other words, she's telling him, if you don't get the church back to Rome, this is how history is going to judge you. And not just history, but God himself. Because you have been given the time and the power to resolve this conflict, and you have chosen not to. That's on your soul. And this is when she concludes the letter with, of course I'm only concerned about your salvation. When she learned in a letter that goes, and interestingly, not all of the letters back to her from Gregory XI have survived. But she learned somehow, we don't know if it was through a letter that did not survive or through some other means of correspondence from some other individual. But when she learned that Pope Gregory XI was under duress or under, I wouldn't say the word attack, but he was being heavily influenced by a certain group of cardinals in Avignon who really were pushing for him to keep the papacy in Avignon. She wrote, I'm going to skip this one because I have this a little bit out of order. She wrote to him and she said, I have prayed and shall pray, sweet and good Jesus, that he free you from all servile fear. Now let's talk about servile fear. Does anybody know what that means? Servile?
Excessively dutiful.
Huh?
Excessively dutiful.
Excessively dutiful. That's a great way to say it. That you're overthinking this. You're too fearful, right? May honor and charity be in you in such wise as shall prevent you from hearing the voice of incarnate demons. I want to show you all this term she uses. Incarnate demons. Who's she referring to? Cardinals. Incarnate demons, and heeding the counsel of perverse counselors, settled in self-love, Now, if you were a cardinal, what must you think about this young woman? Who, as I understand, want to alarm you, so as to prevent your return, telling you that you shall die. Y'all, I love this. Up, Father, be like a man. Be like a man, for I tell you that you have no need to fear. Up, Father, be like a man. Imagine telling the Pope to act like a man. So, this term she uses of incarnate demons is a term that she is fond of. And she uses it again in a completely different context. There is an often attributed quote to her. As a matter of fact, it's probably one of the most famous quotes, perhaps even the most instantly recognizable quotes of her that I'm getting ready to show you. But I want to give you the context because nobody ever provides the context for why she said it. Remember, context is everything. So the situation is that she learned that there was a group of Florentines. There was the faction in Florence who were really not just rebelling against the Pope, not openly rebelling against him, but were publishing materials that were very critical of him, not in a way that was constructive or helpful, but in a way that basically denounced the office itself. Okay? So, do you know what I mean by this? Yeah. That you might not like the person that's in the office of Pope, and gosh knows throughout 2,000 years of history there have been more than a few of these, that we could say maybe we don't like the person who's in the office. We perhaps don't like their way of communicating, their style of communicating. We don't like certain decisions they've made, whatever. She was fine with that. Obviously, she's fine with that, isn't she? She's fine with criticizing the Pope. What she cannot abide is people who criticize the institution and who miss the point that it is not the person, but the office. So she hears that there's a group of men in Florence who have been very critical of the papacy itself, even beginning to question whether or not this was still the same institution that Christ provided for all those many, many centuries ago, and the promise of Matthew 16:18. The promise of Matthew 16:18. Upon this rock I will build my church. And what's the second part of it? The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That's a promise, people. It's a promise. And Catherine understood this. So when she hears that there's these men who are being critical of the office itself, this is what she says in a letter to them. These people don't even know her, right? Even if the Pope be an incarnate devil, she loves that word. Even if the Pope be an incarnate devil, we ought not to raise up our heads against him, but calmly lie down to rest on his bosom. He who rebels against our Father is condemned to death, for that which we do to him, we do to Christ. If we honor Christ, if we honor the Pope, we dishonor Christ if we dishonor the Pope. So what happened when these Florentines got her letter? But this is just part of, by the way. This is not even probably 1/25 of the letter. What do these Florentines do when they receive her letter? They shut up. She has that much influence. And again, even to people that she didn't even know. So, both Pope Gregory, both these Florentines have sort of felt this from her. And then, what happens, of course, is that as a result of this letter, up, Father, be like a man, for I tell you that you have no need to fear. 1377 is when he receives this letter. Early 1377. And he moves the papacy back to Rome because of her persuasion. Sadly, the cardinals that she mentions here, the voice of the incarnate demons, those cardinals that she calls incarnate demons here, sadly, they were seemingly right. He moved the papacy back to Rome and did not live a year. He did not live a year, dying very suddenly under normal circumstances. We don't have any reason to suspect any kind of foul play. But upon his death in 1378, early 1378, naturally what happens is the College of Cardinals is convened to elect a new pope. In this case, because the papacy had been outside of Rome for 70 years, you can imagine what the anxiety level was among the Romans. They want the papacy to stay in their city. So there's a Roman mob that surrounds the college. And they demand that the next pope be Italian. They demand it because they don't want to lose the papacy again. And let me just put one little footnote on that. Could you understand why the Italians themselves would be so concerned about the papacy being in Rome? Is there any reason to go to Rome if the papacy's not there in the 14th century?
Sure.
Is there any reason for people to visit that city, to make pilgrimages to that city? The merchants obviously want this, the commercial interest. There's a tremendous economic connection to the papacy being in Rome. So they surround the college and demand that the next pope be an Italian. So the college elects Urban VI. And he's an Italian. Right? He's an Italian. And everybody's happy. Except who? The French cardinals, who were in the conclave, who then convene their own conclave and elect their own pope, Clement VII, who moves to Avignon. So now we have two popes. We have a pope in Rome, Urban VI, and we have a pope in Avignon, Clement VII, who is the first of what we call the anti-popes of this period, because he was not validly elected. Catherine, imagine, is inconsolable. And I don't mean that with anything other than heartfelt emotion for her. She was inconsolable. It said that she wept for days. She withdrew from the world for a month. She took all the blame on herself. She's the one who convinced Gregory XI to return to Rome. She believed that she'd been responsible for that she was doing God's will by writing him these harsh words. Well, in her mind, they were not harsh, they were direct. And look what happened. The papacy entered an even darker period, if such a thing is possible, an even darker period, where for the next 40 years, we have a great schism in the papacy. Two popes at one time. And because the medieval world understood that all of God's grace, all of God's power flows through the supreme head, the supreme pontiff, into the church, into the sacraments, into the lives of every one of us, then do you see how she could take this a little bit personally? That she somehow was responsible? So did you live in an area where you were receiving the sacraments from the anti-pope? Or were your sacraments valid because they were served by the authentic successor to St. Peter? And I don't think that this is something we have a frame of reference for in the 21st century. I think it's difficult for us to understand what a challenge this was to the medieval mind and the medieval soul to know this. So, she, as I said, it's in many primary accounts how she responded to this. After about a month of seclusion, she emerged and she began writing more letters. This time, words of true encouragement to Pope Urban VI. And she wrote words of warning to those cardinals who brought about the schism. Remember I told you the French cardinals who brought about the schism? She addresses them as incarnate devils too. You incarnate devils! I exhort you for the good of the church and the salvation of your souls to renounce the schism and support the legitimate pontiff. Did they heed her? No. And immediately after this, her health began to very rapidly deteriorate. She died less than 3 years later after the Great Western Schism. So, in her life, as I said, there are many miracles that are associated with her. And at last count, and you can do an internet search and find numerous hundreds of miracles in individual lives up to 2018 that have been attributed to the intercession of St. Catherine of Siena. She apparently is a very powerful intercessor. And with these words, can you imagine having somebody like this on your side? But in her own lifetime, the mystical life that she led, the intensity of her prayer, the severity of her personal penance that she imposed on herself, her personal piety, we have some remarkable stories that sort of sound very familiar to a 20th century stigmatic we talked about. Anybody remember St. Padre Pio?
Yeah.
And some of the things that have been attributed to him. For instance, and this is reported by eyewitnesses, people who would observe her in prayer, that she seemed to be weightless and would float off the ground when she was in her most intense periods of prayer, that she could do that. She was known to be able to read the thoughts of others, and this is kind of what made me think about St. Padre Pio, because remember I told you he would come out of the confessional, basically come out of the confessional, open the door and call somebody out and say, "You're lying," right? Or you're omitting something, you're not telling the whole story. Apparently that she had this ability to read the thoughts of others, and she would, at the most sort of random moments, rebuke the people in her presence. Just look at someone and say, "You need to repent." And we won't talk about it here in public, but if you'd like to know more about it, let's you know. And she would call people aside and rebuke them for something they had done in their life that she knew about. She was once praying at a Siena jail. She frequently visited prisoners in jail. And she was once visiting with a man who was condemned to die, whose heart was very hardened by all accounts. Very hardened, didn't want to see her, didn't want her to pray with him. And he observed her in prayer for him having a vision. He observed her having a vision. Not that he saw the vision, but that he saw her incredible rapture at this particular moment. And when that moment of rapture ended, she looked at him and she said, "I have seen your soul entering heaven today. Pray with me." He did. He was converted on the way to his execution. So that's reported by many, many sources. Among plague victims, and again, this is something that's almost too numerous to count, because this, remember, was the age of plague. So among plague victims, her ministry among them was to go into plague-stricken areas with no fear for her own safety or for her own life, and physically touch and pray for each person that she came across, and try to do what she could to relieve their suffering in that moment. In an age when there's so much superstition about plague and how it was contracted, that she would do this is quite remarkable. That she never contracted plague is quite remarkable. But there are many cases in which she touched a plague victim and God healed them through her touch. That's recounted, as I said, almost too many times to count. So yes, indeed, she is, I think, without question, a truly, truly remarkable woman who lived in a remarkable age, but in a way that is so timeless that she continues to speak to us today. And I dare say there's some of these things that you could not only take away for your personal life, but for our corporate life as a church. That everything she says is timeless because it's truth.